Welcome, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today at the 2020 Virtual Fairfax County Public Schools Mental Health and Wellness Conference and Inova Act on Addiction Summit. This webinar series would not be possible without the generous support of Joan and Russell Hitt. Before I introduce our speaker, here are a few housekeeping notes. All participant lines have been muted and everyone's video has been turned off. We will be taking questions via the Q&A feature, and they can be submitted at any time. We will do our best to get to as many questions as we can. Our speaker today is Dr. Joseph Williams, Associate Professor of Counselor Education at the University of Virginia. He is a faculty affiliate with the Youth Next, the UVA Center to Promote Effective Youth Development, and with the Center for Race and Public Education in the South. His professional interests include multicultural and social justice training practices for K-12 counselors, educators, and other helping professionals. We are very excited to have you here today, Dr. Williams. Take it away.
All right, thank you to Fairfax County Public Schools, as well as to Bethany for the invitation to be with you here this evening. I'm excited about our presentation, talking to kids about race and racism, promoting their positive social-emotional development. And so again, thank you for being with us this evening. I'm gonna jump straight into the presentation just out of sake of our time today. And so just to start with a few agenda items that I hope that we're able to actually take away from our time today. The first one is, what I hope to do is actually discuss the importance and benefit of talking to kids about both racism and race. The second thing I want to talk about are common mistakes that oftentimes parents or adults or caregivers make when talking to kids about race and racism and ways in which we can overcome them. And then what I want to leave you with today are some kind of best practices in terms of strategies of broaching these conversations with children and adolescents and in ways that are developmentally appropriate. And so I'm hoping that you would be able to kind of take those away. Again, what we're trying to do today is condense what's normally a 2.5 hour presentation down into 45 minutes. And so I hope that once the resources become available to participants, you'll be able to review the slides and the resources at your own pace, a pace that's more conducive to your own style of learning. And so again, thank you for being here this evening. I'm going to jump straight into, again, our presentation. It's really hard to have conversations about race and racism without first laying out definitions. And so what you see here are some child-friendly definitions, the ones that I use with my own kids who are elementary age, but I also use these exact same definitions with middle school students, high school students, as well as adults, right? And so anytime you hear me today talk about prejudice, really one of the things I'm talking about is believing negative or bad things about someone who's different from you without proof. Right? So again, child-friendly definitions. Stereotypes, idea about a group of people which could be based on their skin color, right? Or it could be based on other qualities such as the gender or their religious affiliation, right? Or even sexual orientation. And so again, that's what would be stereotypes. Discrimination would be to unfairly treat a person or a group of people because of who they are, because they're different from you. So treating them unfairly because they are different from you. When we're talking about race, we're using a very basic notion. We're really talking about skin color of a person. So anytime we're talking about race today, we're talking about just the skin color of a person, right? Which is different from ethnicity and culture and some other terminology, right? And so again, just to make sure that it's developmentally appropriate, every time we talk about race, I'm talking about skin color. When we're talking about racism, we're talking about treating people unfairly because of their race or because of their skin color, right? And there's really two ways that we can actually have a conversation about race. And one of the things that I didn't mention that I probably should have mentioned at the beginning is that you may have a lot of questions. Please feel free to throw those into the Q&A box. And at the end of the presentation, we're going to try to save time, I believe 10 minutes or so, to address your questions. So maybe you came into the presentation with burning questions. Don't wait to the end. Feel free to throw those into the chat box now, and we'll get started with that. So I always say that there's two different ways of talking about race, right? Which is why the presentation is talking about race and both racism. One is about the physicality of race, right? This could be the skin color, physical features, or even hair texture. So that's one way of actually having a conversation with children and adolescents. Is about, again, just talking about race. And it's very again, a developmentally appropriate stance. The other one is the social experiences as it relates to races. So what are the experiences of people based on their race, their physical skin color or physical features or what have you. So again, one looks at physicality, the other one looks at it more socially, right? What are the social norms, attitudes, and beliefs and behaviors that are based on race, right? And so again, just two different ways of actually talking about it. I think it's really hard to talk about race without talking about racism, and it's really hard to talk about racism without actually talking about race, if that makes sense. And so sometimes I like to distinguish that when talking to my own kids or even middle school or high school kids for that matter. Uh, a few things that it's always important to think about is that we as parents, as caregivers, or even as teachers, or those who actually work with young kids, whether they're children or adolescents or even young adults, that we have to kind of do some of the self-reflecting work ourselves when having these conversations. And so I always like to start these presentations with some self-reflection in terms of thinking about the first time you were aware of your race or your racial identity. And not only the first time you're aware of your race or racial identity, but what were some of the messages that were communicated to you by your parents or by caregivers as it relates to your race, right? Or did you have these conversations at all, right? And so reflecting upon our own experiences with our own racial identity and how we were kind of socialized to understand different aspects of race would really help think about identifying potential barriers that might trip you up when having these conversations. So there may be some things that your parents or caregivers or teachers did that was really, really influential and really positive and your understanding of race and yourself as a racial being. And there may be some other things that were not so beneficial. And so those are the things that we want to really stay away from moving forward. And so again, I'm always interested in getting what was your experience like and how comfortable are you with having those conversations as it relates to both race and racism, right? So now let's get into it in terms of children. And so one of the questions that I get a lot is, so kids are oftentimes too young to talk about race. And if we actually start to have these conversations, what we're going to do is actually implant racist ideas or ideas about differences being bad into our kids' head, right? And one of the things that we see when we look at social science is that that actually is not the case at all. Actually, we're kind of hardwired to actually recognize skin colors even as early as toddlers, right? One of the things that you might see on the slide, or you might not see, is that when we look at social science and what they actually show in terms of ability to actually recognize race, that we see the kids as old as 3 to 4 months have the ability to actually recognize race and distinguish based on those racial recognitions. And so using eye scan technology, we see the kids actually start to distinguish race pretty early. And not only are they distinguishing it, but they're actually behaving differently towards those individuals who most oftentimes look more like them. And so we see that at a very young age, that toddlers or even kids actually are starting to not only recognize race, but again, when you start to actually transition into the toddler age, they're also developing ideas about race, right? In terms of superiority or inferiority. Again, by the time they start primary school, these ideas are actually put into place. And so when you're having these conversations with your children, especially your young children, you're not actually implanting ideas in their head. Basically, what you're doing is actually seeing what ideas already exist. Again, because kids make sense of the world and they want to make sense of the world that's actually around them. And again, they may be subject to ideas about racial stereotypes by their classmates, by the preschool teachers, or by middle or high school or elementary school teachers, or even parents, right? And so again, we see the initial awareness of race begins at a little bit earlier than 6 months, and then children of color, usually younger than 5, show evidence of actually being aware of that and negatively impacted by prejudice and stereotypes about their racial groups. And so again, we see that as young as 5, the children are not only aware, but negatively impacted by the prejudices and stereotypes about their racial groups. And so again, children begin to actually express and develop racial preferences and biases that reflect societal values of whites over blacks per se, or people or children of color by preschool age, right? So again, we're talking about 2 or 3 years old. We're not even talking about adolescents or even young adults at this time. So again, it's important to think about that. And again, we see that happens throughout the lifespan. And one of the things you start to see is that once kids get to that 13 to 16 age range, that their ideas about racial groups and the differences about those racial groups, and oftentimes the stereotypes that they actually associate with those racial groups, starts to actually wing off. And for some, we'll say that, you know what, that's actually a really good sign. It means the kids are actually learning and they're actually becoming more tolerant. But what we see is actually the winging off is not necessarily because kids are actually more tolerant or teens are more tolerant. We see that kids start to wing away from those negative racial associations and stereotypes that they have about others and about themselves based on race, is because they start to actually learn the social norms of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate in terms of talking about race. And again, we're going to show a video a little bit shortly to kind of emphasize that, right? And so again, we see that it's very important to talk about race because kids are actually, again, creating these racial narratives about others. And again, we want to actually help them to be able to kind of think more about race in ways that are critical, as well as ways that are more appropriate. And so again, when we really think about how or why this actually happens, there's a lot of different reasons. But one of the reasons is that kids are actually just motivated to learn, right? And to kind of conform to broader culture and social norms that, again, oftentimes are reflected in society. And so one of the basic premises within this presentation, which we won't really get a chance to really go into, is that you have to believe that we live in a racialized society, right? And not just a racialized society, but we live in a society where a racial caste system or racial hierarchy actually exists, where those individuals who self-identify or may be perceived as white are at the top of the racial hierarchy, and those who are Black are at the bottom, and those who are self-identify as people of color are kind of in between. And so there's a racial hierarchy that actually exists. And that's a really important premise to actually really reflect upon, because it really gives way to why we actually need to have these conversations. And one of the things that you'll see throughout the presentation is that oftentimes we talk about kind of like this white-Black dichotomy, that it's not to say that race is only actually assigned to just white and Black, but it's to say that when we actually look at the research, most of the research actually looks at race in those terms. And so I wanted to report what research actually says versus kind of just my opinions, right? So again, children are actually collecting information about the world to kind of gauge what are social norms. And again, it helps to actually construct their realities and their beliefs, right? And so again, kids and adolescents are oftentimes, they're still working out their cognitive muscles, right? And so again, those cognitive shortcuts and structures, again, they're still developing. So kids aren't able to actually really make sense of the world. And so they're looking at, again, social cues, what they see in the media, what they see in their textbooks, what they see on cartoon shows. Again, kids are actually pretty aware, and we'll show again another clip of that as well. And again, we see that again in a society that's built on a racial hierarchy, that oftentimes there's positive associations and characteristics associated with those who are considered white, and associations and characteristics and stereotypes that are more negative for, again, those who are considered people of color. And this is, again, kids actually learning from just the social world that we live in. So again, for them, it's like a cognitive puzzle where they're just trying to figure out and make sense of some of the rules. And so that's really important. And one of the things that you see here as an example is the ways in which we unintentionally socialize kids. Like, for instance, when we walk into a room, even if it's a classroom, we say, "Good morning, boys and girls." Again, we're sending a subtle message of which parts of their identity are actually important. And in that example, their gender. And so again, where we're just asking or just actually making a really reflective statement, again, there's subtle messages behind it. The kids are actually picking up and making connections, even though they're the wrong connections at times, right? And so again, important of actually really having those conversations as it relates to talking to kids about race and racism. Let me move into our next slide. And again, I think we kind of already summed this up, that although kids are actually attaching meaning to race without adults directly telling them to do so, right? And so kids are aware of race, they're trying to make meaning of race, and just because they're not having the conversation with you, just because your teens aren't having conversations with you, doesn't mean that the conversations aren't actually being had, right? Oftentimes they're underground, right? And so we see them among other kids. And so I always think of it like this: who would I rather educate my kids about race and their racial identity, me or other kids, right? And again, I'm not sure where those kids are actually pulling their information from. So again, there's no accident in terms of how they're actually making sense of the world. Kids are really good, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, at picking up on our blind spots as adults. And so they're studying us, and so they're really good with kind of decoding information about who mom and dad are uncomfortable with, right? Or who the teacher seems to call on more than not, right? And why is that, right? And must it be because of their race? And again, kids are actually just starting to make meaning of the world. So it's important that we're helping them through that process in terms of actually making those meanings. And so I'm gonna pause just for a second and play a video. Hopefully the sound goes well, just to kind of show you what that actually looks like. And let me cue that up for you. This is a video that you can find on YouTube. It's like a 3 to 4 part study. I really strongly encourage you to review it. It's based on CNN. Let me play that for you.
Anderson Cooper, AC 360, CNN weeknights 10 Eastern.
There are lots of different colors for skin.
I have questions for you about these pictures of different children.
After I read the question, I want you to
Point to the picture that fits the story.
Are children colorblind in America?
show me the smart child.
Show me the mean child.
Can you show me the dumb child?
Show me the nice child.
Is bias measurable even at an early age?
Why is she the bad child?
Because she's black.
And why is he the ugly child?
Because he looks like he's white.
Why is he the dumb child?
Because she has dark brown skin.
Why is she the bad child?
Because she makes fun of everybody else's skin color.
How much do kids learn from what they see and hear from adults?
Show me the child who has the skin color most adults like.
And show me the child who has a skin color most adults don't like.
These are questions that we, along with CNN's Soledad O'Brien and a team of psychologists hired by CNN, spent months investigating through tests, interviews with children and their parents. But they're questions that have been asked for decades. The first doll study ignited controversy in the 1940s, when psychologists Kenneth and Mamie Clark pioneered studies in the effects of segregation in schools by asking African American kids to choose between black and white dolls. The so-called doll test found black kids overwhelmingly preferred white over black. Those results were at the center of the landmark 1954 Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education, that desegregated American schools. Now, with the first African-American president and nearly 60 years after segregation was overturned, we wondered, where are we today? How do kids see differences in race? What we discovered might shock you, but first, how we got there.
Skin color, child skin color estimate.
Okay, yeah.
We asked renowned child psychologist and University of Chicago researcher Dr. Margaret Beal Spencer to design a pilot study for CNN and analyze the results.
Our children are always near us, because we're a society. And what we put out there, kids report back. You ask the question, they'll give you the answer.
Spencer's team tested more than 130 kids in 8 schools with very different racial and economic demographics. Half of the schools were in the north, half in the south. Oh, nicely done. While the country is much more diverse today than in the 1940s, the children in this project are from 2 age groups and 2 races, white and black, to better allow comparison to the original doll study. 4- and 5-year-old children were asked a series of questions about these images. 9- and 10-year-old children were asked questions about the same images, as well as this color bar chart. The tests led us to 3 major findings. First, white children as a whole responded with a high rate of what researchers call white bias, identifying the color of their own skin with positive attributes and darker skin with negative attributes.
Show me the dumb child.
Dumb child.
Okay, why is she the dumb child?
Because she has black skin.
Show me the mean child. Why is he the mean child?
Because she's brown.
Show me the bad child. Why is he the bad child?
Because she's black.
Okay. Show me the ugly child. Why is he the ugly child?
Because she's brown, black.
Show me the child who has the skin color most adults like. And show me the child who has the skin color most adults don't like. Show me the child who has the skin color most children like. Show me the child who has the skin color most children don't like. Show me the child who has the skin color most girls want. Show me the child who has the skin color most girls don't want.
The questions that got overwhelmingly white-biased answers?
Show me the dumb child.
About 76% of the younger white children pointed to the 2 darkest skin tones.
Show me the mean child.
About 66% of the younger white children pointed to the 2 darkest skin tones.
Show me the child who has the skin color most children don't like.
Again, about 66% of the younger white children pointed to the 2 darkest skin tones.
Show me the bad child.
More than 59% of the older white children pointed to the 2 darkest skin tones. But some white children did have more race-neutral responses.
So could you show me the good-looking child? So what are you thinking? I know you pointed to them all, but tell me what you're thinking.
I'm thinking that I do not care if they are black, white, mixed, or any kind of race. I think that it matters who they really are.
All right, so I'm going to stop the video there. And one of the things, oftentimes, the reactions that I get when stopping that video is that people are oftentimes thinking about, no, not my child. That couldn't be my child, right? Or it couldn't be my student, or couldn't be my grandchild, right? But the reality is that the parents of those kids who are actually showing white bias or white favoritism, again, we would consider those actually to be normal parents. These aren't parents that were picked somehow in the study because they had adverse views of Black individuals. And again, we're talking about what kids actually learn from their environment. One of the things that you don't see in the study, because there is a part 2 of the study, is that when you ask Black kids the same question, that actually close to 45 to 50% actually answered the same way. Show me the dumb child. And even your Black children would actually point into the darkest skinned child. Show me the child whose skin colors most adults like, that your teachers like. Most of the students who are actually Black and brown will point to the white skin color. So we see some of these internalized signs of, again, they're learning how in society we construct realities around race. Again, remember at the very beginning of the presentation, I talked about that the premise is based in we live in a racialized society where there is a hierarchy that, again, kids are actually picking up on. And so there's another video that talks about, that looks at it from the
kids. Before you watch this episode of Nightly News Kids Edition, please let
this perspective of children of color, which I'll allow you to actually review that on your own time, right? And so that video is called How to Talk with Kids About Race and Racism in America from the Nightly News. And again, it gives you just another insight into what those conversations look like with kids from different backgrounds, right? And for the sake of our time for a presentation, I don't want to take up too much time with the video piece of it, but I do want to get into kind of the social emotional aspect of it. So let me get a second to queue up the next slide. All right. And so as we think about like the positive pro-social emotional outcomes of actually having these conversations, what we see is that when you're having conversations with children and teenagers and even adolescents, what we oftentimes see in the social science research, and those articles are at the very bottom of your slide to really support that, that there's actually a decrease in prejudice, stereotypes, and bias against other groups. We actually can see that, right? Children who actually are having these conversations with their parents are more likely to see discrimination when it occurs, and again, have an increased desire to actually confront it, right? Again, when we think about like social emotional learning, we think about conflict resolution skills. Why are we teaching conflict resolution if we're not actually applying it to current conflicts, right? And think about the racial pandemic that we're currently experiencing, right? Kids are actually who have these conversations with their parents, and I'm gonna give you a spoiler alert, these aren't parents who are actually perfect at having these conversations. These are parents who actually make plenty of mistakes, self-included, right? But even having the conversation, we see that those kids who actually report having those conversations are actually more equipped with the words and strategies to deal with experiences of discrimination and racism. And so when we think about our Black and brown and indigenous little boys and girls, again, having these conversations oftentimes serves as a proactive way of actually helping them to actually navigate and anticipate those encounters and to be able to actually confront it. And so some would say, again, if I have this conversation with my child, won't I actually increase their anxiety? Won't I increase kind of their fear of being discriminated against? And what we see is that actually doesn't happen. It's similar to when you have conversations with kids about stranger danger, right? When you have those conversations, oftentimes kids don't develop a level of anxiety for the most part that prevents them from going out and acting in their daily interactions outside of the house, right? Because they're fearful that someone's going to snatch them. No, you're actually having that conversation as a preventative tool to help them to be aware and to stay alert. And when something actually happens, to actually respond in ways that are appropriate. It's the same thing when we're having these conversations about race. We're really trying to educate kids and prepare them to have these conversations because, again, that is a reality. We see that there's actually also increases in positive self-esteem and sense of identity. So we talked about the internalization that happens with children of color as relates to their understanding of race. The more parents, the more caregivers and teachers are actually having these conversations, the more their racial identity and positive self-esteem starts to actually become more identified. Again, and exploring or displaying more positive identity towards their own racial group and other groups. So again, we also see increases in group intolerance. They're more comfortable around questions as it relates to race and having those conversations. So there's a lot of benefits. A lot of them actually hit that social emotional kind of developmental check marks in terms of, again, these conversations have actually been steeped in research to show to actually be very proven, right? There's a few common mistakes that I want to kind of just highlight before we get into some strategy, because I would assume that for most of you, you actually logged into this presentation because you're interested in actual strategies. And again, I want to make sure that we spend time to actually address it. But it's really important for me to kind of lay the groundwork that, you know what, our kids are terribly biased, even if we don't believe that we are, right? And kids are picking up things, they're discriminating in their play, they're assigning roles in plays based on race, that these things are actually happening whether we want to admit it or not, right? Whether we have these conversations or not, kids are actually learning about race, they're making associations about race, they're oftentimes assigning the stereotypes that they're learning about race with individual people. And again, these things are actually happening, whether we like to admit it or not. And so we need to have these conversations. And again, I believe that for most of you on this call, you probably believe that that is actually a true statement, and that's why you're here. And so I really want to applaud you for that. But recognizing that it's just only one step, right? We have to take the next step and think about how do we have these very awkward and uncomfortable conversations, right? Which for some of us, maybe our parents didn't have these conversations with us, and so we're not really sure how to actually address it. And I'm hoping that this workshop, this presentation, won't be the last time that you grapple with these issues and you actually think about the resources that might assist you in actually doing that. A few common mistakes that we oftentimes see, or that I oftentimes see, is really adopting a colorblind perspective. And again, there's a lot of harmful impacts of actually adopting a colorblind approach to raising your kids, where you may say that, you know what, I don't see color, I don't raise my kids to see color. Or maybe you're a teacher and you say, you know what, in my classroom, I don't see color, I just see one race, the human race. And while I get and I understand where you're coming from with that, it actually has a reverse effect that may be unintentional, right? But again, one of the things that you're actually communicating in a way that may be subtle is that, again, aspects of a person's experiences aren't that important. And the reality is that race shapes how we interact with others and how others interact with us, how we interact with the world and our environment, and how the world actually interacts with us. And so again, when we take that colorblind approach, children may never talk about the issue when acts of exclusion, rejection, or discrimination occur based on race. Right? Children may get conflicted messages, right? That, again, I shouldn't do something about it, but we never talk about it. Or, you know what, race is actually a good thing, and we all have a race that's unique to us, but we never really actually talk about it. And so why is that? Why is it taboo? So again, they're getting those conflicted messages. And again, when parents don't talk about race or say that race doesn't matter, but actually children notice our social networks, right? And that they're not diverse, right? Or lack thereof, right? Students notice that when parents actually tense up around certain groups of people, again, the kids are actually, very scarily, right? They're really good at actually picking up our biases, right? And our blind spots. And so kids are actually addressing that. And we're gonna get into that. Parents talk about race or say that race doesn't matter, but kids are actually noticing social networks is important. When there's inconsistency between words and actions, we got into that just a little bit. And again, when we actually shut down, ignore, kind of brush off race-based conversations, right? That sends, again, mixed messages in terms of the importance of actually dealing with this issue. And these are some of the common mistakes that we oftentimes hear from both parents, and we also see it in research from parents, as well as teachers and educators about having these conversations, right? And so the consequences, well, maybe I should actually go back and say before we get into some strategies, is that there actually are consequences to those mistakes, right? And we already talked about the kids may never have that conversation. We also sometimes see that kids who aren't having these conversations, they actually test higher in terms of correlation, in terms of increased anxiety and confusion about, again, racial experiences. We're teaching kids to ignore racial differences and racial inequalities, and we're allowing implicit bias to grow without question. And again, the thing with implicit bias is that, you know what, it's only a matter of time between those implicit biases that we have bleed out into our actions, right? And so again, it's important that we actually think about it, because there are some real life consequences to not having these conversations about race, right? And this is usually the part in the conversation where I make some comments that may not be appropriate or seeker friendly, that you have to think about the privilege of actually having these conversations, right? So if you self-identify as white, the reality is that you may not have to have this conversation, right? Although we just explain why you should have the consequences, the conversation. It could be very much so that you say, you know what, that's not my kids, that's not for me, and we're not gonna have those conversations right now. We're gonna wait till they bring it up, or we're gonna wait till a little bit later, or what have you. And again, that's a privilege to actually have the decision, but understand that choice comes with consequences, right? For parents of color, where we oftentimes see that these conversations are more normal because we're doing it as a preventative mechanism to actually avoid potential issues when they arise, right? Not if they arise, but when they arise. And again, go back to those first slides, that there's a lot of research that shows that even as young as toddler, kids are actually starting to experiment with race-based discrimination in terms of who they want to play with, the type of play that they actually engage in, and so forth and so on. And so now we can kind of transition into the heart of the presentation. And again, forgive me if we're kind of moving along at a pace that might be a little bit quicker than you may be used to or accustomed to. And again, I know it's a lot of information to process, but I am hoping that, again, once this material becomes available, that you're able to kind of go at it at a place that's more suitable to you moving forward. And again, please feel free to throw in your questions to the chat, excuse me, not the chat, but necessarily the Q&A box, so that we can actually address as many of those as possible. And so again, I'm really eager to hear from you. Right. So let's get into what many of you probably are here to address. I'm going to talk about some research-based strategies. We're talking to kids about race and racism. And again, one of the things that I oftentimes say, but you don't see here, is that I oftentimes say, you know what, select one. I'm going to give you 8 strategies. What we do see in social science research is that if you give people too many strategies, they don't do anything. So I'm going to ask you to select one. So we're going to show you 8 in the next slide. Feel free to look at them and say, you know, which one of those do I want to implement in the next week or so, right? Which one of these do I want to implement in the next week or so, right? And again, one of the things that you're going to notice is that these are evidence-based best practices and strategies, but they're not groundbreaking, right? These are kind of common sense approaches that I think research has actually shown are really important in terms of actually addressing the implicit preferences or biases that kids have, that children have, in terms of how do you have this conversation? How do you broach the conversation moving forward? And so again, keep those questions coming as we actually get into some of these evidence-based strategies. Again, I'm going to ask you to select one. Select just one strategy. Feel free to do more than one, but I want to make sure that you think about one that you're going to do within the next week or so. And I wish there was a way in which I could actually hold you accountable to making sure that you actually implement that moving forward. Right. And so again, you see the strategies right there. I'm going to go through them and give you a few examples, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So we see the importance of initiating the conversations about both race and racism, the importance of asking questions as a tool. And again, this applies to, I believe, parents. It applies to caregivers, grandparents, teachers, administrators, anyone who's actually interested in having conversations about race with children and adolescents, whether you're in elementary, middle school, or even high school, right? And so if you have high school kids, it's still not too late. You say, you know what, we've never talked about race, and I have high school kids. Have I destroyed them? Not at all. It's never too late to have these conversations. This is different, right, from the birds and bees conversation, right, where you kind of have a conversation about the birds and bees. You don't really need to visit it again for a number of years, right, until maybe the kids are a little bit older and they're starting to develop in certain ways, right? This is an ongoing daily conversation that actually could be had, right? The importance of actually answering the questions of your teenagers, of your children, of your toddlers, right? The importance of actually seizing teachable moments, preparing children for racist encounters. We talked a little bit about that. Using a developmentally appropriate lens when having these conversations. Remember that what you say is important, but what you do is even more important, especially for kids from ages 5 to 13. Again, your actions are more important than what you actually say. And then the importance of actually facing your own racial biases. And so I'm going to go through these, give examples, and then I want to open it up to questions that you might have so we can really get into conversations. Right? So the first one is initiating the conversations. Oftentimes what I hear is parents say, or caregivers or teachers to say, you know what, I'm going to prepare myself for when my kids bring it up. But the reality is what if kids don't bring it up, right? Doesn't mean that they're not thinking about it. Doesn't mean that they're not making those associations. And so again, it's important that we actually initiate those conversations, and we look for ways to initiate the conversations, right? Many people also believe that, you know what, the last thing teens are interested in is having a conversation with their parents about race. But again, even if teens aren't initiating conversations about differences, find ways to bring those topics up with them, particularly, again, as we talk about race. And so again, we're talking about both preventative race chats and reactionary race chats, right? And so I always say that make race talks with your children or your teenagers routine. Revisit it again and again in many different ways over time, whether you're having a verbal conversation or whether you're actually using media such as books and bibliotherapy, or you're using films or movies to actually have these conversations. And as we mentioned earlier, that this isn't a one-time conversation. So this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. It's an ongoing conversation, right? And again, you have those chats that are more preventative in nature that actually can help children form positive views about themselves and people of different races, so that when children observe or absorb views about race, again, we know that that actually has happened, but how do we actually make it more preventative and more positive based? And there's also the reactionary chats, right? Or responses to events or experiences from your children's life, right, as they happen. An example of a reactionary chat that would have been in that second video is, how do you explain George Floyd to your children? Or do you explain George Floyd to your children, right? Or to your adolescents or to your teens? Do you think they're too young to know about that, right? Do you think they're not paying attention, right? Again, what we see is that, you know what, that they are, and they have something to say. So again, plan for a marathon, not a sprint, and think about conversations that are both preventative in nature and reactive. And so I start to say, you know what, start naming and identifying race as a part of the way in which you describe the world. Yep. Who's that character? Yeah. And she has pretty black skin, pretty brown skin. Yeah. That character, yeah. You know what, that skin color we would consider white, right? And so again, when you're looking at picture books or watching TV shows or even viewing advertisement, begin to kind of include skin color and race in ways that you use to describe the world. And again, kids and adolescents, they're used to that, right? Cool blue truck. I like that really nice pair of black and brown shoes, right? And so if we use race to actually describe people, there's nothing wrong with that, right? People have races. We have racial identities, right? And again, we'll get into some other ways in which you can think about that in terms of how do you ask those questions, which jumps into our second conversation in terms of, again, use questions as a great strategy or tool to actually help you, to aid you in having these conversations, right? And so again, I'm always saying, encourage your children or your teenagers to share their race-related experiences, and feel free to actually explore their thoughts about it, right? What are their thoughts? What are they thinking? What are they feeling, right? What are some of the behaviors? What do those actions actually look like, right? And so some activities I say is that, you know what, feel free to ask questions early and often, right? And some questions I always say that, you know what, and these are questions that I ask my own kids, right? Or there's certain groups who never get to be the hero in the comic books or the movies, right? Who gets to be considered pretty, right? My kids love, you know, the whole Let It Go, you know, Princess Anna, right? If Princess Anna's skin was black, would she still be beautiful? If her hair was different, would you still want hair like her, right? There's just conversations that I just throw out, right? Sometimes my kids answer, sometimes they ignore me, but that's fine. We're having these conversations, right? Do kids in your class ever get teased for being different in some way, right? How do you think you would feel if you were Hispanic or Latino and you read this book or watched this TV show or this movie, right? Understanding that most of the media we have is riddled with stereotypes and misperceptions and lies about people from different groups. And media is actually oftentimes one of the main ways in which we're socialized to learn about other groups. And when I say media, I'm not just talking about Facebook or Instagram or TikTok. I'm talking about your textbooks and classes, right? And the other media that we actually consume, right? I ask my teenage students all the time, what are the cliques in your school, right? Who sits together? Who doesn't? Who's excluded? Who's included? Is any of that associated with race? And again, it's just about having conversations, ongoing conversation, right? Another one is, again, kids have answers, or kids have questions, feel free to answer them, right? And again, encourage your kid to ask questions and share their observations and their experiences, and to be really respectfully curious about it, right? And you know what? It's okay not to have the answers, right? If you don't take anything away from our conversation today, please take that away from it, right? That you don't have to have all the answers, right? It's okay to say that I'm not sure. Let's come back to that later, okay? Just make sure you come back to that, right? To be honest and direct and descriptive, right? Oftentimes kids have questions, and you know what? They're not looking for a thesis or a dissertation in terms of the response. You'd be surprised at how just very simple, short, to the point answers are actually oftentimes enough for kids, right? One of the things I always say is that, you know what? Don't assign adult attentions behind kids' questions, right? And again, so again, part of it, this is really about us as parents, as teachers, as educators, as grandparents, as those who are actually in positions to work with kids, that it's really about pushing past our own discomfort, right? So again, my kids say a lot of things, and you see it in this the framework that's in front of you, right? Why do white cops hate us is a question that my son asked one day, just out of nowhere, right? As we're eating breakfast. We have to address that, right? You know what, buddy? All cops, they don't hate us, right? But there's some who, because of the way in which you look and the way in which your skin color is, that again, they may have negative thoughts about our behavior and what we might want to do, right? And then right when I think that that's a satisfying answer, my son will follow up. Well, how do we know the good cops from the bad cops? I don't know, right? I don't know. We'll have to come back to that later, buddy, right? So again, thinking about those things. Why do her eyes look so thin, right? How can you be my dad when our skins doesn't match, right? One of the things that we're trying to, I have my youngest daughter is 5 years old. I'm trying to convince her that she's black. She said, how can I be black when I'm brown? I don't know. It's a good question, right? Race doesn't really make sense. We don't really fit neatly into those boxes, right? Other questions that you can actually steal as parents, look at, again, I don't know enough about why, and fill in the blank, right? Or a kid says something. What do you mean about that? What do you mean by that, right? Or what makes you say that? Or you know what, buddy? You know, that's a good question. Or it's a really good observation, right? Or I'm just curious. What makes you say or ask that, right? Let's talk about this. I feel blank, right? You know what? There's a word for that. We call that like stereotypes in our society, right? Again, I want to talk about this, but I'm not sure how. Like, let's come back to this, right? So these are stems that you actually can steal. And maybe those of you who are actually listening, you have stems that you've used. Use them, right? There's a website, and I have tons of websites for you that I encourage you all to actually go to. It's called 100 Race Conscious Things, and those are linked to it at the end of the presentation. That again, it looks at a lot of the different themes and stems that you can use to have these conversations, right? And again, you know, there's a lot of people who are sad and mad because a police officer hurt, or we can actually put it, killed a man who was black, right? And one of the ways in which they're airing out their anger is that, you know, they're protesting. Do you know what a protest is, right? It has those conversations. Or maybe your kids are older. You can say, you know what are your thoughts about George Floyd? I don't care, you know, or, oh, yeah, that's sad, but that's about it. Maybe we can explore that, right? Does it bother you that you're not as concerned about that, right? And again, you can have these conversations. And again, they don't have to last for hours. Sometimes it's a check-in, right? So please utilize that website. A few more before we start to transition into the question is, again, think about teachable moments, right? Again, especially for school-age kids, they respond better in lessons that involve real-life examples, right? Rather than kind of artificial stage discussions, right? So again, use their impolite questions or observations. Use social media or images or toys. I gave a presentation a little bit ago about the impacts of racism on mental health. And we talked about how social media is one of the channels or the avenues in which oftentimes teenagers and adolescents are actually exposed to racial incidences like George Floyd's death, right? And it's in a cycle, and responding over and over. Use that as an opportunity to have this conversation, right? Use music video and songs, right? Again, a lot of the media, a lot of songs are riddled with stereotypes. Question it. Help kids actually start to think about things more critically so they actually can apply that. There's tons of books that are available. And again, I have resources for you all. So I'm not just giving you kind of blanket suggestions, right? There are some real resources as it relates to that. And also, again, think about the news. What's relevant, right? We talked about conflict resolution and social-emotional learning. Apply it to what's going on in the world, right? Again, using real current events to prompt such conversations. And I don't know if this slide has ever been true as it is today. Like, you can't turn on the news without there being real events to actually prompt these conversations for you actually to have. A few more. I think we're right at schedule. In about a few minutes, we'll take a break and address some questions. Prepare kids for racist encounter. This is particularly for parents of color, right? Black, brown, and indigenous kids, right? You have to introduce them to the idea that, you know what, some people get treated unfairly based on their skin color, right? This is like one of the worst things about parenting to me, that I have to actually tell my kids that, you know what, people may actually have negative views about them just based on how they look, right? I have to steal the innocence. That sucks, for lack of a better word, right? But the reality is that I'd rather do it as someone who loves them than someone who doesn't out on the street, right? Or another kid. I have to prepare for that. That's the world we live in, right? Be honest about, you know, instances of historical and current events, right? Again, when people have been mistreated because of those differences. And so again, role play. I oftentimes do what if scenarios. What if you hear this? What if you heard that? What if you see this? What are some things you might do, right? Actively prompt kids to consider other thoughts, feelings, the experiences or feelings of others in terms of their experiences. And this is that perspective taken. What I'm going to close on is just a few developmental appropriate ways in which you can actually do that. For kids who are ages 2 to 5, honesty is one of the best ways you can do it, just to be honest. Again, don't encourage kids not to see color. Embrace their curiosity. Foster pride. Some people think that, you know what, having a conversation about race is only to talk about slavery. or oppression or racism, right? But you can talk about the beauty of race, right? And racial identity, right? And contributions and how it should be celebrated. It doesn't always have to be negative, right? Again, kids who are 6 to 12, I say, you know what, talk about race and racialized stereotypes and hostilities and how they escalate, right? Again, these are like our younger elementary, middle school kids, right? Encourage kids to talk about what makes them different and discuss why and how like the differences in terms of race might work for them and might work against them, right? And acknowledging the many ways that people are differences and challenging intolerance, right? Again, kids may say or do things, and again, it's important that you help them work through that. A few more as we conclude with some questions is, again, if you have teenage kids, again, have those conversations with them, right? Again, if you don't take anything from these conversations, it's the worst conversation is no conversation at all, right? So ask them about their groups that they most identify with at school. Discuss the labels and stereotypes that are associated with such groups. Ask them to think of what do they think, what do they learn about these issues, what's going on in their head, right? And there's more ways in which we can actually talk about this with kids who are ages 13 through 17. And again, the last two that I'm actually going to turn it back over for question and answer is again, talking is both said and unsaid, right? I always say that who's in your world, right? Who's in your circle? You can't say race is important. It's important to have diverse friends, but everyone who comes to your house or used to come to your house pre-COVID looked like you. Who's your doctor? Who's your dentist? Right? Who are your good friends? Right? Who you're more comfortable around? Like your kids are picking up on this, right? Who's in your house? Who are the books? Is a representation there, right? Again, what you say and what you do is extremely important. And the very last thing that I would encourage everyone to do is actually think about identifying some of your own biases. One of the ways in which you can do that is Project Implicit, right? It gives you the opportunity to take implicit association tests where you actually can look at racial biases, gender-based biases, biases based on age, based on weight, right? And again, feel free to wrestle with those things and wrestle with it out loud with your kids and let them know that you're not perfect, right? So again, it's important just to call attention to the messages and questions and talk about your own struggles with it, right? And so as I conclude, just understand that you don't need to have all the answers to have effective race chats with children or adolescents. You just need to be open to being brave and having a brave space to actually have that conversation. And so as I turn it back over so we can actually get at some of your questions and answers, I do want to just make sure that you're aware of the slide and the resources that are actually available to you. You actually see that there's tons of resources with video clips, book suggestions, short stories, media clips. Again, a lot of things you actually can use to help you with this conversation. There's websites that have tons of information about things to do, ways to have this conversation. Again, more websites with curriculum and other information, more websites, even blog articles. I even have some books listed there. And so I really encourage you to take time to go through the references, find out what might be best for you moving forward, as well as those of you who are interested in more of the social science behind it. There's some slides there as well. And so with that said, I'm going to turn it over for our question and answer segment, and I look forward to hearing from you. Hopefully we can get through as many questions as possible.
Wow, I learned so much tonight, and I'm going to have to rewatch the recording because there were so many good activities and resources. So thank you so much. We have quite a few questions, and we'll get it through as many as possible. So you shared a lot of resources, and I just to share with the audience, everything will be posted and shared after the completion of this webinar series. So next week we'll be sharing out all of the resources, so they'll be able to see that. Of everything you shared at the end, do you have a resource we should use first, or a suggestion that we should go to first?
Do I have a suggestion first? No, I think if you actually were to go back to the strategies, the very first one, initiate the conversation, as maybe that's the first step, right? To have the conversation, to make a mistake and to come back. I've said a lot of things that are like crazy and I made mistakes and I had to come back. But do you remember when you said that last time? What I meant to say was, or you know what, I didn't answer that fully, right? And so again, it's okay to make mistakes. The key is not necessarily whether you make a mistake or not, but how do you recover from it? And so it's okay to make mistakes. Kids and teenagers are oftentimes pretty forgiven as it relates to these kind of conversations. And so I think the most important thing is to actually have the conversation. And again, for many parents, this always happens that by the time we click off of this webinar and tomorrow you forget about a lot of this material and you say, you know what, I'm not ready to have the conversation. And when I am ready, we will have it. When it does come up, we will have it. And again, I say initiate it, don't wait, right? Be proactive.
I appreciate that. So we have some educators and parents that overlap, and you did talk about some strategies for high school students, but do you have any recommendations for what can be used in the classroom, or should it be built into these conversations on a daily basis? Any ideas for how we can build that into instruction?
Is that for high school in particular, or just kind of K through 12?
The specific question was high school, but
okay.
I'm interested in general as well.
Yeah, so there's some really good resources. So one of the things that you see on the screen is teaching tolerance, teaching for change. This is actually curriculum. A lot of it's race-based and other ways in which we socially identify. There's curriculum, there's lesson plans that teachers can actually incorporate and adapt relatively easy into existing content, as well as school counselors. A lot of information there that's really important. And so one of the things I would encourage you to do if you're a teacher and you're looking for ways to actually integrate this into your classroom is to think about websites that actually already have planned curriculum that's actually available and developmentally appropriate. And so Teaching for Tolerance, the Zen Project, Teaching for Change, a lot of these websites that you actually see have that material that's actually already available for you. And so again, I'm really big on that these things should be integrated throughout the conversations, throughout our curriculum. So they're not just like this one-time conversation that we had one time in the fall semester, but they're oftentimes integrated throughout it, right? And so when we put things into a historical, political and social context, you can't not talk about race and other ways in which we identify. And so yeah, Teaching for Tolerance, Teaching for Change, tons of resources. But again, it's already there. You don't have to create anything from scratch. You just have to be brave enough to actually implement it and be okay with making mistakes.
Well, that's very helpful. And that actually leads into a follow-up question. Any suggestions for a staff member when a parent might complain that the teachers are teaching students about social justice or how to be anti-racist?
That's a great question. And that works best when administration is on board, and not just principals within the school or assistant principals, but also superintendents and other directors within the school district. That again, the more support you have, the more empowered you are to actually have these conversations. One of the ways in which you can do it, regardless if you have that support or not, is actually thinking about using evidence-based practices, using some of the research, for instance, that we talked about here today in terms of how having these conversations is actually building their social-emotional development. For high schoolers, is building critical awareness and critical consciousness, which actually is very much correlated to grades and other ways in which we measure achievement-related behavior. And so there is a purpose to it. But again, part of it I think about what is the mission and the values of the school districts in which you're actually employed. Many of them talk about like the importance of diversity, that we value it and all that good stuff. And so now this is an opportunity for them to kind of put their money where their mouth is. And will it actually back up and support some of your initiatives and some of these opportunities to actually have these conversations? And so again, it's about like, what does your school district really value? And if diversity is one of those things, well, let's talk about race, because that is an aspect of diversity.
Great. Can you discuss any conversation strategies for mixed race families?
Well, I think part of it is again, and I know it sounds like a cheat in terms of the responses, but it's about having that conversation, right? And understand that that you're different. You're different. There are different in terms of the racial dynamics in it. And again, you may not fit into one racial group, but what are your thoughts about that? And again, what if someone asks this question or someone says this? We talked about playing that what if game or that scenarios where you can actually use that as a prop to have these conversations, right? Or just, again, so part of it is just acknowledging that, we're in a multiracial family or multiracial, family for lack of better examples. And again, so we have differences and some people may see that as really weird or strange, but it's not weird or strange because you fill in the blank. But if someone was to ask you about it, how might you respond, right? Or I can also think about it in a more reactionary, right? Has this ever come up? Has anyone ever said something about your mommy or daddy or your grandparents because we look differently, right? What was that like? How did it make you feel? What did you think about it, right? What would you want to do differently, right? I wonder how else we can explain it, right? So you can have those conversations. Again, there's tons of actual bibliotherapy and books that are actually already available around multiracial and biracial families that you actually can use that to bridge and to broach these conversations. So again, you don't have to create it from scratch, because those books and those resources to have these conversations, short stories on YouTube, they're already available, right? It's about you actually plugging into them and actually using them and leveraging them to your advantage. And so I think just acknowledging that, you know what, there are differences there, and those differences aren't a bad thing, right? Sometimes we try to overemphasize our similarities, and we should actually equally emphasize similarities and differences. There's nothing wrong with either one of them, being different or being the same.
Thank you. All right, last question, because we're running out of time. My child has been exposed to family members who make racist comments. How do I combat these statements so that my child doesn't learn to be racist?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and we oftentimes hear that question a lot. It goes back to the slide of what you do in those situations is just as important, and maybe more important than what you actually say, right? And so there's one way in which, and it's a good thing, right? If after your kid overhears that conversation, you go home and you say, you know what Uncle Jimmy said, you know what, we would consider that a stereotype, or that might be racist, and this is why that's actually bad, and it could be harmful for others, like your friend Jimmy or your friend Jake, right? So you can have that conversation, and that's one thing, right? It's another thing that in the moment that you stop Uncle Jimmy or whoever it is, and you say, you know what, I really don't appreciate that comment, or you know what, that comment is hurtful and we don't do that. And again, I'm not sure how that conversation goes with your family, but your children, your teenagers are going to pick up a lot from that, right? You're actually modeling how to actually address it, right? And again, this is where we talk about that this isn't the birds and bees. Like for some of our families, this is a lifestyle change, and it's going to come with conflict, right? If you have to actually, have challenging conversations, brave, courageous conversations with family members who, again, may not be as sensitive or open to diversity and different ways in which we're different. And so again, what you do in those situations is more important than what you actually say afterwards. And so again, thinking about how do you actually deal with that? And so the same strategies that we apply to children apply to adults. What if you hear someone oversay it? What could you do differently, right? How might you respond, right? And again, what might work? What might you want to change? And so oftentimes there's an activity that we do with this where we actually create real life scenarios, and we help practice responding to those scenarios. And so maybe this is one of those opportunities where you can kind of practice different things you may want to say.
Thank you so much. I think the thing that stuck out to me with that last question is having those brave conversations, whether it's with students or children or each other. So thank you. This has been wonderful. We really appreciate you. I wanted to say coming to Fairfax County Public Schools, but tonight. So for more information on the remaining webinars or for resources on substance abuse and addiction, please visit actonaddictionnow.org. We are also putting this link in the chat. Our next webinar is Blending the Head and the Heart, Resiliency with the Pyramid of Success with Dr. David Anderson on Tuesday, September 22nd at 4 p.m. We would be so appreciative if you could also take our survey. The link is also being put in the chat for you. This will help us evaluate our sessions for this year and provide vital information to shape next year's conference, whether virtual or in person. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Dr. Joseph Williams, and we hope to see you in the next webinar.